I never expected the HOA's illegal bridge across my property would be my ticket to millions, turning their power play into my ultimate victory. What would you do if your neighbor's invasion of your land suddenly became your path to financial freedom? Comment below where you're watching from. I watched in shock as strangers in yellow vests measured across my stream. My hands shook with anger as I rushed down the hill toward them. This was MY land paid for with 15 years of overtime shifts and careful saving. The beautiful 3-acre wooded property with its gentle stream was why I chose Willow Creek Estates despite the strict HOA rules. I specifically picked this spot because the property maps showed it was private and secluded. Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing on my property? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. A worker glanced up nervously. Just following orders, sir. HOA approved this bridge project last month. What bridge? Nobody asked me anything about a bridge. My peaceful morning had transformed into a nightmare in seconds. You'll need to take that up with Ms. Winters. We're just doing our job. He pointed toward a woman in a bright red blazer, directing others near my property line. Margaret Winters stood with her trademark pearl necklace gleaming in the sun, clipboard in hand, issuing commands like a general. As HOA president, she developed quite the reputation for getting her way, regardless of who objected. I marched over, property deed in hand. Margaret, there must be some misunderstanding. You can't build anything here without my permission. She barely looked up from her clipboard. Oh, James, the board voted unanimously last month. This connecting bridge will improve community access to the park and raise everyone's property values. The notice was in the newsletter. I never received any notice, and more importantly, you're building on my land without permission or permits. That's illegal. Margaret's perfectly lined lips curved into a condescending smile. Don't be dramatic. It's just a small footbridge that benefits everyone. Why would you stand in the way of community improvement? Besides, the stream area falls under our easement rights. No, it absolutely does not. I have the survey right here. I pulled out my property documents, but Margaret waved them away without looking. We've already allocated the funds. The construction starts tomorrow morning. I'm sure once it's finished, you'll see how lovely it is. My blood boiled as I watched her strut away. 3 nearby neighbors quickly turned their heads when I looked in their direction. They'd been watching the whole confrontation. That evening, I contacted my friend Sophia, a real estate attorney. They can't just build on your property, she confirmed after reviewing my documents. Your deed is clear, you own the land to the north edge of the stream. I'll draft a cease and desist letter immediately. Despite the letter Sophia delivered the next morning, construction equipment appeared before dawn. I photographed everything, the excavator digging into my protected wetland area, workers hammering posts into my stream bed, and Margaret supervising it all with a smug expression. When I approached the crew with my cease and desist letter, they looked uncomfortable but continued working. We're just following orders, the foreman repeated, not meeting my eyes. By week's end, concrete footings had been poured on both sides of my stream. Each day, more neighbors wandered over to watch the progress, some giving me cold stares as if I was the villain for objecting. I filed a formal complaint with the county zoning office, but the next day found my mailbox stuffed with angry notes from neighbors. Stop blocking progress. One read, think about others for once, said another. Margaret orchestrated a whisper campaign against me. At the grocery store, families who once chatted with me now hurried past. Parents at the community pool gathered their children when I approached. Someone even spray-painted selfish on my mailbox. They're trying to isolate you, Sophia warned. It's a pressure tactic. Don't engage directly, document everything. I installed security cameras around my property, capturing footage of Margaret leading small tours of neighbors along my stream bank, pointing at the half-built bridge with pride. The bridge will connect our community like never before. I overheard her telling them. Imagine walking straight through to the park without that long detour. If only some people weren't so stubborn about sharing. 2 weeks into construction, I noticed something odd. County surveyor marks appeared overnight, extending well beyond where I thought my property ended. When I checked my deed again, I realized Margaret had been working with outdated property maps. I hired my own surveyor who confirmed my suspicions. Your property line extends 12 feet beyond where they're building. They're actually encroaching more than they realize. Armed with this information, I approached Margaret at her home, survey results in hand. The bridge isn't just unauthorized. It's extending much further onto my property than you think. Margaret's face tightened. Surveys can be interpreted different ways. The community needs this bridge, and we're building it. Perhaps if you weren't so new here, you'd understand how things work in Willow Creek Estates. How things work? You mean ignoring property rights? I kept my voice level despite my anger. The HOA board has already voted. Construction continues tomorrow. Margaret shut her door in my face. That night, my phone rang with an unknown number. Is this the homeowner fighting the Willow Creek Bridge project? A woman asked. Yes, that's me. My name is Emily Richardson, County Environmental Inspector. We received your complaint, but there's more you should know. That stream on your property is part of a protected watershed. Any construction requires special permits they don't have. I sat up straight, suddenly seeing a new angle. Can we meet tomorrow? As the sun dipped below the horizon, I watched workers pouring more concrete near my stream. Little did Margaret know, her precious bridge project was about to face obstacles she never anticipated. And I now held information that would turn her power play completely upside down. I woke to the sound of cheering outside my window. Peeking through the blinds, I saw Margaret leading a group of neighbors in hard hats, posing for photos beside the half-built bridge. They were passing around a bottle of champagne at 8 a.m. on my property. Let's toast to community progress. Margaret raised her glass, her voice carrying across my yard. Soon we'll all enjoy easier access to our beautiful park. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone to record their trespassing. This wasn't just about a bridge anymore. This was a direct challenge. They were celebrating on my land without permission, drinking alcohol before breakfast like conquering heroes. When I stepped outside, conversations halted mid-sentence. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me. What a lovely surprise, I said calmly, still recording. I wasn't aware I was hosting a party on my private property this morning. Margaret's smile didn't waver. We're having a little bridge-warming celebration. You should join us instead of fighting progress. It's for everyone's benefit, after all. Everyone except the actual property owner who never gave permission, I replied, counting 6 HOA board members among the group. I noticed none of you responded to the legal cease and desist letter. Mrs. Jenkins from the corner house looked uncomfortable. Margaret told us this was all handled properly, that you were just being difficult. Did she also mention the county environmental inspector who visited yesterday? This construction violates protected watershed regulations. Margaret's face flushed red. Don't listen to his scare tactics. We have all necessary permissions. I've documented everything, I continued, still filming. The unauthorized construction, the trespassing, today's little champagne party. My attorney will be fascinated. The crowd began dispersing quickly, leaving Margaret standing alone by her precious bridge foundation. You're making enemies you can't afford, she hissed. This neighborhood has ways of dealing with troublemakers. That afternoon, I found my car tires slashed in my driveway. The security cameras caught nothing, but the message was clear. I called Sophia immediately. They're escalating. What can we do to stop this construction faster? I filed for an emergency injunction, she explained. But Margaret called in favors with Judge Harrison, who's delaying our hearing. They're racing to finish before we can legally stop them. The next day, trucks delivered steel bridge beams before sunrise. Workers bolted them into place while I watched helplessly, waiting for our court date. Margaret drove by twice, smiling and waving each time. That evening, an unmarked envelope appeared in my mailbox containing photos of other problem homeowners who had fought the HOA. One had moved away after constant harassment. Another, after mysterious water damage to their home, was deemed not covered by insurance. Couldn't sleep that night. What if the bridge was completed before our court date? Would a judge force them to tear it down? Or would I be stuck with an unauthorized structure on my land forever? The phone rang at 11:30 p.m. "Is this the homeowner fighting the Willow Creek Bridge?" a man's voice asked. "Who's asking?" I replied cautiously. "Thomas Reynolds, Riverside Development. I've been following your situation with interest. That bridge they're building, it might be worth millions to the right buyer." "What are you talking about?" I sat up straight. "Meet me tomorrow at Oak Street Coffee at 9 a.m. Bring your property documents and survey. You'll want to hear this." The next morning, Thomas slid a folder across the table. "The township has been trying to connect their trail system to your neighborhood park for years. This bridge creates the perfect link if it has legal access rights." I flipped through the documents, stunned. "You're saying the HOA accidentally built infrastructure that completes a major trail connection?" "Exactly. The township would pay handsomely for an easement. But here's the interesting part. Only the property owner can grant those rights, not the HOA." For the first time in weeks, I smiled. "So they're building something valuable, but I control its use?" "Precisely. And from what my sources tell me, the township has budgeted several million for this connection in next year's Parks Fund." I left our meeting with newfound confidence and a strategy. Rather than fighting the bridge directly, I would let them finish it, documenting every violation along the way. When I returned home, construction had accelerated. 24 workers swarmed over the site, racing to complete the project. Margaret stood with the HOA treasurer, pointing at blueprints. "Good afternoon," I called cheerfully. "The bridge is looking lovely." Margaret's expression shifted from surprise to suspicion. "Had a change of heart?" "Let's just say I'm seeing the bigger picture now. By the way, did you get permission from the Army Corps of Engineers? This waterway falls under their jurisdiction." The treasurer paled visibly. "You said that wasn't necessary, Margaret." "It's not," she snapped. "He's bluffing." I shrugged. "Might want to check federal regulations before making that claim. But please continue building. I'm fascinated to see the finished product." Their confusion at my sudden shift was almost comical. As I walked away, I heard Margaret hiss, "Find out what he's planning." Over the next week, I methodically built my case. Emily from the environmental office provided documentation of watershed violations. The county inspector confirmed no structural permits had been filed. I even discovered Margaret had misrepresented the project to her own board, claiming she had my written permission. The bridge neared completion as our court date approached. Workers installed lighting, railings, and decorative elements. A sign appeared, "Grand Opening Saturday, connecting our community." Friday night, I received a frantic call from Mrs. Jenkins. "Margaret's holding an emergency board meeting. She knows something's wrong but won't tell us what. She wants us to sign paperwork transferring liability from the HOA to individual board members." What should I do? "Don't sign anything," I advised. "And you might want to attend tomorrow's grand opening. It should be quite educational." Saturday morning arrived with perfect blue skies. Margaret had ordered a ribbon across the bridge entrance and invited local news to cover their community achievement. Neighbors gathered, many looking uncomfortable when they spotted me standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. As Margaret stepped forward with giant ceremonial scissors, a black SUV pulled up. Men and women in official jackets emerged, representatives from the county zoning board, environmental office, and the township manager. Margaret froze mid-speech. The scissors hung limply in her hands as the officials approached. "What's happening?" someone whispered near me. I smiled as I stepped forward. "I believe we're about to find out who really holds the power over this bridge and what it's actually worth." The certified letter arrived exactly 3 days after the HOA meeting. Margaret wasted no time. The HOA's legal team demanded I cease interfering with community improvements and claimed I had given implied consent by not physically blocking construction workers from entering my property. They threatened countersuits for property value diminishment if I pursued legal action. I photographed the letter and sent it to Sophia, who called me within minutes. "They're scared," she said, laughing. "This letter proves they know they've messed up. Implied consent isn't a thing when they trespassed on clearly marked private property." We have your no trespassing signs on file, your cease and desist notices, and your police reports. So what's our next move? I asked. Let me file our response. Then we wait. They'll come to you. Sophia was right. That evening, my doorbell rang as I was fixing dinner. Margaret stood on my porch, alone for once, her usual confident posture slightly diminished. When I opened the door, I noticed dark circles under her eyes. May I come in? She asked, attempting to sound authoritative but not quite succeeding. I stepped aside and led her to my kitchen table, offering coffee which she declined. The HOA board has considered your situation, she began, as if doing me a favor. We understand there's been some confusion about the bridge project. No confusion on my part, I replied. You built on my land without permission. That's trespassing and property damage. She flinched but continued. We can work something out, she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone I'd never heard before. The HOA will purchase an easement for a reasonable fee. We've prepared an offer. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a contract offering $25,000 for permanent easement rights to my property, including the bridge and surrounding access paths. Define reasonable, I replied, closing the folder without signing. Margaret's jaw tightened. That's more than fair. The bridge benefits your property too. It increases your land value. Funny you should mention land value, I said. I've had 3 different appraisers out this week. Do you know what they valued my property at with the new connecting point you've created? She didn't answer, but her fingers tightened around her purse strap. Much more than $25,000, I continued. Try adding a few zeros. That's absurd, she exclaimed. No easement is worth millions. Pine Valley Township seems to disagree. They've been trying to connect their trail system to our park for years. Your bridge suddenly makes that possible. Margaret's face flushed. We won't be extorted. That's our final offer, she said, returning to her imperious tone. Otherwise, we'll contest any sale and tie you up in court for years. You built on protected wetlands without permits, I replied calmly. Environmental protection agencies tend to take that seriously. Are you prepared for those fines while we're tied up in court? Her confidence faltered. You wouldn't. You started this, Margaret. Not me. As she gathered her purse to leave, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Daniel Cooper, the Pine Valley Township manager. Margaret saw the name flash on my screen, and her eyes widened. Excuse me, I need to take this, I said, stepping into the living room. We've increased our offer, Daniel said without preamble. The council voted unanimously tonight. $7 million for your property and all access rights. We want to create a public nature corridor connecting our communities. I'll consider it, I replied, loud enough for Margaret to hear. Send over the paperwork. When I returned to the kitchen, Margaret stood rigid by the door. $7 million? She whispered. That's impossible. You created quite a valuable connection point, I said. Just not valuable to you. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. This isn't over. The HOA won't allow you to sell to outsiders without approval. Check your bylaws again, I suggested. There's nothing preventing property sales to municipal governments. Your own rules, Margaret. After she left, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the HOA's pathetic offer. My phone buzzed with texts from neighbors who'd heard rumors about the township's interest. Some expressed support, others concern about outsiders taking over. Eleanor from 2 doors down sent, "Whatever you decide, some of us understand why." Margaret went too far this time. The next morning, flyers appeared on every door in the neighborhood except mine. Emergency HOA meeting, threat to community integrity. All must attend. I smiled as I photographed one. Sophia had warned me this would happen. They'll try to rally the community against you, she'd said. Don't engage. Let them dig their hole deeper. That afternoon, county environmental officials arrived at the bridge site, responding to an anonymous tip. They posted stop work orders and began taking samples and photographs. Construction workers packed up their equipment, looking confused and annoyed. My doorbell rang again as the officials were leaving. A reporter from the local newspaper stood on my porch with a photographer. "Mr. Reynolds gave me your contact information," she explained. "We're doing a story on development disputes and environmental protection. He mentioned your situation might be newsworthy. I invited her in. As we talked, I showed her my documentation. Property surveys, no trespassing signs, cease and desist letters, environmental reports about the protected wetlands. So the HOA began building without your permission, without permits, on protected land, and now a neighboring township wants to purchase your property for a public nature corridor?" She clarified, taking notes rapidly. "That's correct," I confirmed. "And how has the HOA responded to this development?" "They've offered me $25,000 for what the township values at $7 million, I said, "and threatened legal action if I don't accept." The reporter's eyebrows rose. "May I quote you on that?" "Absolutely." As she was leaving, Margaret's car screeched to a halt in front of my house. She jumped out, face contorted with rage when she spotted the reporter. "What lies are you spreading now?" she shouted, charging up my walkway. The reporter turned, notepad ready. "Mrs. Winters, perfect timing. I'd love to get the HOA's perspective on building the bridge without environmental permits. Our readers are very concerned about wetland protection." Margaret froze mid-step, suddenly aware of being on record. "No comment," she muttered, retreating to her car. The news story ran the next day. HOA bridge project halted. Environmental concerns and property rights clash. The article detailed the unpermitted construction on protected wetlands and mentioned Pine Valley Township's interest in creating a public nature corridor. By afternoon, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neighbors, other developers, environmental groups, and even Margaret's husband all wanted to talk. I let everything go to voicemail except one call from the Pine Valley Township Council, confirming they'd scheduled a public meeting to discuss the potential purchase. What Margaret didn't know was that I'd already spoken with my attorney about donating part of the land as a conservation easement, which would give me a substantial tax benefit while ensuring the wetlands remained protected forever. The township's plan would preserve the natural beauty while creating public access. Exactly what I'd wanted all along. As evening fell, I watched from my window as cars filled the community center parking lot for Margaret's emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be there. The newspaper article, the stop work orders, and the township's interest had shifted the power dynamic completely. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Margaret's losing it. Board members questioning her decisions. Some suggesting her removal as president. How soon will you decide about selling?" I smiled and typed back, "Soon. Very soon. Emergency HOA meeting tonight at 7. The notice appeared on every door in the neighborhood except mine. Luckily, my neighbor Sam texted me a photo of it. I wasn't about to miss this. News of the township's $7 million offer had spread like wildfire. I arrived early and took a seat in the back. The room buzzed with whispers that stopped when I walked in. Parents pulled children closer, as if I were some kind of monster. Margaret stormed in 5 minutes late, her designer heels clicking loudly across the floor. Her face was red, her normally perfect hair slightly messy. "This meeting will come to order," she snapped, banging her gavel so hard it echoed. "We face a crisis that threatens our entire community." She pointed at me without looking my way. "This individual is trying to profit from our community bridge. He wants to sell his land to the township for millions while we get nothing." Angry murmurs filled the room. A man I barely knew stood up. "That's not fair. We paid for that bridge. With money you never had permission to spend," I called out. Several people turned to stare. Margaret slammed her gavel again. "You'll wait your turn." I stood up slowly. "Actually, I think it's my turn now, and I've brought some friends." The side door opened. In walked 5 people in official-looking clothes. I'd spent weeks building these relationships: County Inspector Johnson, Environmental Officer Rivera, Township Planner Davis, Wetlands Specialist Wong, and my attorney Ms. Murphy. "Who are these people?" Margaret demanded, her voice rising an octave. "The people who actually have authority here," I said, walking to the front of the room. I pulled out my folder of documents and photos. "Let me show everyone what's really been happening." I connected my laptop to the projector. The first image appeared, my original property survey with clear boundary markers. Next came time-stamped photos of the construction beginning without my permission, followed by copies of my cease and desist letters. "This isn't a community bridge," I explained. "It's trespassing, pure and simple." The officials each took turns speaking. Inspector Johnson went first. "No building permits were filed for this structure," he said, holding up papers. "That's a direct violation of county code." Officer Rivera showed maps of the protected wetlands. "This construction has disrupted a delicate ecosystem. The fines start at $10,000 per day from the date construction began." Township Planner Davis explained how the bridge had accidentally created the perfect connection between trail systems. "We've been trying to create this nature corridor for years. It would increase property values throughout the entire area by approximately 30%. With each speaker, Margaret's face grew paler. The board members looked stricken. My neighbors' expressions changed from anger to confusion to horror as they realized what their HOA had done. "You can't do this," Margaret finally sputtered. "We voted. We have meeting minutes." My attorney stepped forward. "Voting to trespass doesn't make it legal, Ms. Winters." I took the microphone again. "I have two offers on the table. The township wants to buy my land for $7 million to create a nature preserve that will benefit everyone. Or I can accept the HOA's insultingly low offer and leave you all responsible for the environmental fines and legal penalties." Margaret's husband Jack, who rarely spoke at meetings, suddenly stood up. "How much are these fines exactly?" Officer Rivera consulted her notes. "At minimum, $320,000 so far, possibly up to $1.2 million depending on the ecological damage assessment." A stunned silence fell over the room. "The HOA doesn't have that kind of money," the treasurer admitted quietly, "which means a special assessment on every homeowner," I pointed out. "Probably around $15,000 per household minimum." The room erupted. Parents who had pulled their kids away from me were now yelling at Margaret. Board members whispered urgently to each other. Someone in the back shouted, "Resign!" Margaret tried to regain control, banging her gavel uselessly. "We need a private board meeting. Everyone else must leave." Nobody moved. Instead, my neighbor Eleanor stood up. I hadn't spoken to her since she'd joined Margaret's bridge-warming trespass party. "Did you ever actually ask permission to build on his land?" she asked Margaret directly. Margaret blustered. "It was implied. He didn't stop us soon enough." My attorney held up the timestamp cease and desist letters. My client acted immediately. Eleanor walked over to me, right in front of everyone. "I'm sorry," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "We had no idea she never got your permission. We thought you were just being difficult about the details." One by one, neighbors began coming forward, apologizing, asking questions of the officials. The meeting devolved into small groups, with Margaret standing alone at her podium. Ignored. The HOA board hastily called for a private session in the side room. Through the glass window, I could see them arguing fiercely. Margaret pointed and yelled. Two board members took off their HOA pins and walked out. I stepped outside for fresh air. The township planner followed me. "We can increase our offer to $7.5 million, he said quietly. "The council is meeting tomorrow. This is exactly what we've been waiting for." I looked back at the chaos in the meeting room, at Margaret's red face as she screamed at the remaining board members. "Let me sleep on it," I replied. "I think the board might have a new president by morning." My phone rang at 6:15 the next morning. I fumbled to answer it, still half asleep. "Hello," I mumbled. "Is this the future millionaire?" It was Thomas, the real estate developer who'd first opened my eyes to the bridge's potential value. "What are you talking about?" I asked, sitting up in bed. "Turn on your local news right now," he said. "Channel 8. I grabbed the remote and clicked on the TV. My jaw dropped. There on screen was Margaret, being interviewed outside her house. The headline at the bottom read, HOA President resigns amid bridge scandal. I acted with the community's best interests at heart. Margaret was saying, her voice shaking slightly. There was no intentional wrongdoing. The reporter wasn't buying it. Sources say you proceeded without permission from the landowner and without required permits. Is that correct? Margaret's famous pearls seemed to choke her as she tugged at them nervously. No comment. I've said all I need to say. She turned and hurried inside her house. The camera panned to show Eleanor standing nearby. We've elected an interim board, she explained. Our first priority is resolving this situation fairly for everyone involved. I turned down the volume and called Eleanor immediately. I didn't know they'd be filming this morning, she said apologetically. Everyone's in shock. Four board members resigned last night after reviewing the legal implications. What happens now? I asked. We've scheduled an emergency meeting for tonight. The township representatives will be there. We want to fix this properly. That evening, the community center was packed. Not just with homeowners, but with people from neighboring areas too. Township officials sat at a special table near the front. Camera crews from 2 local stations set up in the corners. The new interim HOA president, Ted from down the street, opened the meeting. We're here to right a wrong and find the best path forward for everyone. Township manager Cooper presented their official plan. My property would become the centerpiece of a 120-acre nature preserve connecting 3 communities. The illegal bridge would be removed and replaced with a properly engineered structure slightly downstream. The township's final offer, $7.8 million. This is a win for everyone, Cooper explained. Property values near nature preserves typically increase 20 to 30%. The trails will be maintained by the township, not the HOA, saving on dues. And the environmental violations will be addressed as part of the project. A hand shot up from the back. It was Margaret's husband, Jack. What about the fines? Will homeowners still have to pay? Cooper looked to Environmental Officer Rivera, who stepped forward. If the remediation plan is approved, we're willing to waive the financial penalties. But the HOA must acknowledge the violations and agree to the restoration plan. Ted looked at the other board members, who nodded. We agree, and we have a proposal of our own. He unveiled a document titled Willow Creek Estates Governance Reform. The plan included hiring a professional management company instead of relying on volunteer homeowners, creating a transparent approval process for all projects, and instituting term limits for board positions. We never want something like this to happen again, Ted said firmly. A small commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. Margaret had arrived, looking smaller somehow without her usual confidence. She took a seat in the very back row alone. I was called to the front to speak. Standing before my neighbors, people who had whispered about me, left nasty notes, and treated me like a villain, I felt strangely calm. I bought my land for peace and privacy, I began. I never wanted to be at the center of a neighborhood fight. But when my property rights were violated, I had to stand up for myself. I looked directly at where Margaret sat. This was never about money. It was about respect and following the rules we all agreed to when we moved here. The room was silent. I continued. I accept the township's offer with one condition. 10% of the sale, that's $780,000, will go into a trust for maintaining the nature trails and educational programs about wetland preservation. The crowd broke into applause. Even Margaret gave a tiny nod. 3 weeks later, I signed the final papers. My 3 acres, along with the infamous bridge, now belonged to the township. My bank account showed a balance I'd never dreamed possible. $7,020,000 after my donation to the Conservation Trust. On my final day in Willow Creek Estates, I supervised the movers loading the last of my furniture. A small group gathered on the sidewalk. Eleanor, Ted, and several other neighbors. We brought you something, Eleanor said, handing me a large envelope. Inside was a framed copy of the new sign for the nature preserve, Willow Creek Nature Corridor, where community and conservation meet. Below that In smaller letters, established 2025, made possible by a generous donation from. My name was on a public park sign. I blinked back unexpected tears. We're naming the main trail after you too, Ted added. It seems fitting. As we talked, a black SUV pulled up. Margaret stepped out, looking uncomfortable but determined. She walked straight to me. I came to say goodbye, she said stiffly. Goodbye, Margaret, I replied. She hesitated, then added, and to say I was wrong. I should have asked permission. I should have followed the rules. It wasn't quite an apology, but from Margaret it was monumental. We all make mistakes, I said. The important thing is learning from them. She nodded once, then walked back to her car without another word. After the movers left, I took one final walk down to the stream. The township's engineers had already begun work removing the illegal bridge. Soon, a proper one would stand in its place with educational signs about wetland ecosystems. I thought about how differently this could have ended with lawsuits dragging on for years, neighbors permanently divided, and no one winning except the lawyers. Instead, a mistake had transformed into something beautiful. My quiet property would now be enjoyed by thousands of people. The neighborhood had better governance, and I had financial freedom I never expected. As I walked back to my car, keys in hand for the last time, I passed Margaret's house. She was in her garden, planting flowers, her ever-present pearls catching the sunlight. Our eyes met briefly. She didn't smile, but she didn't glare either. Progress. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, remembering how excited I'd been to move here years ago. Life takes strange turns. The bridge that was built to walk over me had instead elevated me beyond what anyone could have imagined. My new beachfront condo was waiting, bought with cash. No HOA in sight. Sometimes in life, you have to stand your ground to discover just how valuable it really is.